Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to NASM Live. My name is Prince, and as always, I'm here with Wendy and Marty. How are we both doing this afternoon?
Fantastic.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you.
All right, great. And as always, we have Greg behind the scenes making sure that this is a well-oiled machine for the duration of the webinar. So we're going to continue our CES discussion. And we're going to talk about youth athletes today. I'm talking about some special considerations that that you may want to think about when you're training youth athletes, some concepts around them being a special population, some variables that you want to be aware of, and we're going to give you a training template. So with that, are we ready to go?
Yes.
So Wendy, how are we going to help Timmy get out of the well and become a hero in a half shell?
Well, again, Marty and I were excited about this topic because, there's a lot of information that we can cover on a lot of different variables. And so we are going to talk mainly about strength training today, considering we are going to do a program and kind of walk through the things that Marty and I both liked and have done with some of our youth athletes before. So overall, you want to think about strength training. These programs can benefit children and pre-adolescents by improving not only their strength, but also their bone density, balance, lipid profiles, fat-free mass, and of course, personal self-esteem. And research has shown that school-age children should participate in at least 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous, developmentally appropriate, of course, physical activity each day. So some of the primary concerns, and that's what we want to cover regarding strength training specifically, is the safety and its effectiveness. And with some of the research that's out there, if a strength training program follows the recommended guidelines and the precautions and is safe and effective, it's fantastic for children. And there's no real minimal age requirement for any type of participation, although children must be able to follow directions. They need to demonstrate adequate balance as well as proprioception, which generally occurs around the ages of 7 and 8. And, of course, for starting the program, you obviously want to get a medical clearance and a full exam done by a medical professional, same as you would do with an adult.
Okay, excellent. And so I wanted to ask you a question about this. This is open for both of you, Wendy and Marty. We're talking a lot about foundational movement patterns. It's one of the considerations when we're training youth. We want to make sure that all of that stuff is dialed in. But in doing some reading in preparation for this, there are a couple of other factors that are important for the development of the youth athlete. And one point is around cognition. How do you help an athlete analyze and understand their movements so that you help them build that mental connection to the movement? And how do you work with them emotionally? How do you get kids to love exercise so that they don't become an adult that has a negative association with training? So any one of you jump right in, tell me your thoughts on that.
Marty, you can go first, seeing how I just spoke.
Sure. No problem. Certainly. So, when you're dealing with youth, obviously, you got to, this still would go for my regular clients, is you got to try to understand what motivates them or what may demotivate them. So you're never going to go wrong with keeping everything positive. Especially in the coaching aspect, if you are coaching, if you do cross over and do coach the sport, we're talking about fitness here right now. But you also have to understand that, children, especially if you're doing things in a group, you got to be careful about self-esteem issues and, the whole awkwardness that comes with, children and, getting people to make sure that it's a supportive group. You don't want people to be identified and, picked, and singled out for maybe their lack of ability at this point. Prentiss, I know you and I are on the same age. When we were back in phys ed, you'd pick teams and then you were always worried about being the one that stood there last. So, even when we look at fitness, we want to set everybody up for success and have that positive encouragement, because that will absolutely carry over to later in life when people have this negative connotation towards anything exercise or fitness related, because not everyone is going to move as well or be as coordinated or as fit. And, there's a lot of factors that go into that. And we don't want that to be anything that is magnified. We want everyone to be successful. We want encouragement. We want people to, if there is a group, we want people to, work together to help bring everybody up and, use everybody, to make that a very positive and encouraging environment. And even if you're doing one-on-one, you're still going to want to highlight the positives, and you're going to want to highlight their successes. And then when you look at what we're trying to accomplish, we're really trying to accomplish movement patterns, just like we do with our adults. I've always said, I don't train movements. I don't train muscles, I train movements. So getting that, dialed in at a very early age is going to have great carryover for later in life. And I can use myself as an example. I played a lot of sports and I played outside a lot. But when I first got introduced to fitness, it was immediately into strength training. It was squats, bench, deadlifts, things like that. And I know that affected my long-term movement later in life because I was really locking in patterns under load that I had to kind of change once I learned these models. So it really kind of, you've got this great opportunity to really wire them, from an early age and get them to move well first. And then obviously make it fun and kind of gamify it a little bit, because children, in essence, they like to play. So why not make your fitness program more like some type of thing that's fun and engaging for them?
I think making it fun and having that positive emotional experience does a lot. Even if someone's not so-called talented, we all know that kind of runs along a continuum and people get better at their own rate. But if they have that emotional buy-in, that emotional bond, what you're doing with them with movements will go a long way into keeping them focused and involved for the long term. And what do you say about that, Wendy?
Yeah, I'm right there with both of you guys. I mean, it has to be fun. And, Prentiss, you spoke about this earlier. We really can be a huge influencer in these children's lives to whether they're going to really love whatever it is that you're doing with them, or later on decide that this just isn't for them for other reasons other than, they're just not skilled at that particular thing that you're showing them. So, for example, if it's a specific sport, you want to motivate them, because the more that they know about a sport, then the more they're going to remember the important points necessary for like the performance as well as motor skill development. And I think that's crucial. I mean, if you're always saying that's not right, don't do this, and everything's very negative, then it kind of gives them a negative thought about whatever it is that they're doing, and then they're not going to want to do it any longer. So then they give up and quit, which is obviously what we don't want to happen, considering our obesity, numbers, as well as just, children lacking the excitement about playing sports and just becoming physically fit.
Yeah, and I think you brought up there's another good point on that slide, and that is about specialization. And it very well may be the case that athletes aren't talented in certain sports, but if you get them to love the idea of participating, they will find that their particular niche of sports or sport or activity that works for them, and they'll be able to thrive.
Mm-hmm. And that really does kind of bring us into that next one about, the differences really between sports specialization as well as diversification, if you will. And so, let's take two steps back and let's talk about the difference. Early sports specialization can be defined as the year-round, intensive training and a specific sport with the exclusion of other sport at any age. And then, of course, on the other hand, when we're talking about sports diversification, it's the participation in a variety of activities through an athlete's life, and of course, what we've read and what we've seen, this helps develop multilateral physical, social, as well as physiological skills. And so, when you're thinking about that, you want to think about some considerations and concerns for both, So, if you're thinking about the specific, specialization, in order to, make a child really good at something, we think that it's going to have to be structured practice, and, it's going to contain certain developmental components. And, it's basically working on one motor skill development for that specific sport. And so therefore they become very good and knowledgeable and motivated in socialization in that one particular area, but then, you're going to have you're going to have success if you do that particular sport, and they will achieve success in that sport setting, including things like running and jumping and kicking and throwing and stuff. And if a child has an immature, but if a child has an immature level, a fundamental skill development, then they may attempt to play that organized sport, but the experience may not be as positive as someone who was developmentally ready to learn that sport, So you want to think about that. And then when we think about the sport diversification, this can be thought of, again, as playing, many sports. And, Marty and I have talked about this, but this method exposes children to a magnitude of sports that focus on more playing than just practicing, if that makes any sense. And it's going to provide an environment that's going to nurture a genuine love for a sport, so that it's productive and structured, and then that way you can have a practice that may follow later on. And, the belief behind the sport diversification is that the physical and cognitive abilities are going to develop quicker, by playing multiple sports instead of just one, because of the potential of crossover from playing multiple sports. So, for example, instead of just only developing hand-eye coordination as it pertains to hitting and throwing in baseball, a child can be playing baseball and then also play soccer, and then they're developing like foot and hand-eye coordination as well. So, those are some considerations to think about when your child is going into sports. Do you want them to play one sport or multiple sports?
Okay, great point. And Marty, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, and we're talking, and there's some great research that's really, coming to the forefront right now. Dr. James Andrews and all the great research that they're doing out of Birmingham, Alabama, and they're looking at, for one sport is a perfect example. I live in South Florida. It's a mecca of travel baseball, and there's a couple other areas in the country that have the same issue, and that right around 12, 13, the parents and or the athlete are kind of putting the individual youngster into one sport, and they're playing it almost year round. And, the rate of injuries, for Tommy John surgeries and all of these major injuries that you wouldn't expect to see in youth athletes is increasing as they begin to specialize in one sport. So I know Dr. Andrews, you could find a lot of his research and comments out there that he is basically begging parents not to have athletes specialize in one sport, especially when you're looking at some of these sports such as overhead throwing athletes, the higher risk sports to begin with. And going back to, my original background as an athletic trainer, I went into athletic training to wait for athletes to get hurt. It's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. So sports are great, and we're always going to encourage you to do sports, but we don't do them because they're great for us orthopedically. But then when you put that stress on the youth skeleton, and, Wendy and I'll talk a little more about this, you can be setting them up for long-term issues that, they may break down a lot sooner, even though they're becoming better in that one sport than these athletes who play multiple sports. And all of a sudden you see them peak, towards late high school into college because they're a more well-diverse athlete.
Yeah, so those are all really good points. Now, let me ask you a philosophical question, Marty. How do you manage that? Because the nature of the game is this, and this is just my own personal observation. It's a little bit different than when I grew up. There weren't all of these dedicated leagues, and the potential for kids, moving forward and playing at higher levels, maybe they don't get a look unless they spend time in groups like AAU ball in various sports. How do you manage that and suggest that to parents, or maybe in working in collaboration with coaches, that we allow these kids to play multiple sports?
It's a great thing that you bring that up, because I can tell you firsthand, I've had these exact conversations being an athletic trainer and, with my background, and then, because I've trained professional baseball players, of course, the parents wanted me to work with their kids. And so I would have these exact questions and answers, with the parent. And I would always do this without the child there. I would sit down with the parent and say, okay, I've got the best interest of your child, short-term and long-term. Here's what I know as a professional is, if you're going to specialize, here's the risks: mental burnout, fatigue from the child from just participating in the sport, and increased risk and injury. And I would just say, here's data, and I would go look up the most current research and show them. And now, if the goal, and if this times it's the athlete driving apparent that they're that passionate about the sport. I was a diehard baseball guy, but I lived in upstate New York. The off season was forced upon me, right? So I couldn't play all year. If I lived in Florida, I guarantee I would have. So sometimes you got the parent that you need to bring them back to reality and calm them down a bit, and sometimes it's the child. You got to find that balance. But I would speak to the parent, be like, okay, if this is going to be a year-round sport, you are really going to have to invest equally in the amount of time and attention to these programs that I give you. These aren't optional. When I ask them to get their recovery in and they're sleeping and to, not always play the same position, work with the coach that they're not getting as many innings, because sometimes you're dealing with two coaches. You've got your travel ball coach, you've got your regular coach, and they're not communicating, and they're getting too much volume in that way. And I would really spell it out for them. And I think most of it, the parent and the athlete would be very appreciative, because if you really show them that, hey, this is based on the best research, and this is really what the highest level athletes are doing, you're going to have to do your foam rolling. You may have to invest in the recovery tools, and you're going to not have to be, you can't eat Doritos. You're going to have to go to bed early and drink more water and do all this stuff. The people are compliant, and I think they're appreciative, and they really want that extra level of service and care. And I think it's a great opportunity for all of you professionals here to, offer that. And if the athletes are compliant, you have a much better chance of getting them to the end goal without injury. But if they don't listen to that advice, at least you do what you can do by offering that full plan, and then that's everything that you can do as a professional.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. Those are all really valid points, and yeah, it's a hard sell, but you're doing this in the best interest of your athlete if you're able to educate them on the dangers sometimes of doing too much too soon. I don't want to hold this discussion up. I've been looking through the program as we've been talking. So let's talk about, let's move to movement assistance. Are we ready to go ahead?
Sure.
All right.
So of course, as we've talked about for multiple weeks now, and obviously as you NASM professionals know, movement assessments are just as important with a youth athlete or as working with an adult. So, considerations of doing an overhead squat, of course, you're going to set up these individuals using the 5 kinetic chain checkpoints. You're going to perform the squats and gather the information that's needed. And then from there, you're going to create, of course, an individualized based program, according to the results. If they are capable and you saw that, it would be safe, of course, for a athlete to perform a single leg squat, then you would go ahead again, set them back up in the 5 kinetic chain checkpoints. They would keep their hands on their hips, perform 5 squats. Again, you're going to gather that information. And just as a reminder, if you get different data from your overhead squat and your single leg squat, you're going to use the lower body data that you receive from your single leg squat to build the correct program for that specific client or athlete.
Okay, so let's move. I think we're good with this information. I think we've talked about the overhead squat assessment. So but let's go back to that. What are some common things that you see with your youth athletes?
Well, for me, unfortunately, it's about the same. We still see commonly the feet turning out from overactivity of the lateral gastroc and short head of the bicep fem. Of course, because they're sitting for long hours in a day at school. So hip flexors are overactive, and then they go and do some sort of hip flex dominant sport, such as running and being in a shortened position. That's not uncommon. So overactive hip flexors. And then, of course, the being on their phone, on their computer, sitting at a desk, the rounded shoulders and forward head. So those are the common ones that I see. And again, I can't say that there's something that is more noticeable with youth athletes than even my professional athletes that have been in the league for years. I don't see a lot of differentiation in between the two at all.
That's interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
The only thing I was going to add in there is this all is very relevant for just youths if you're training youths as well. Not everyone's going to train youth athletes. But what I've noticed, and I think the stat this out is just the youth tend to be less conditioned than we were at our age because we used to play outside. We used to just be more active, even if you weren't quote unquote an athlete. There was just more physical activity. So, even if you're not dealing with youth athletes, I think everything that we're talking about is still very relevant and pertinent to those people that you're just trying to get to become more physically fit that may never play a true organized sport.
Yeah. And just for people listening, I'm using athlete in the ubiquitous sense. I treat everyone as an athlete, regardless of where they are, just in my mind, competitive or not competitive, recreational. So, once you get in there and you're working out in the gym, regardless of how you perceive yourself, to me, you're an athlete. I have to treat you that way. And just one thing, the reason I asked that question previously is that because my daughter is in dance, I see a dancer, a lot of low back arch, and because they haven't developed strong movement patterns in their hips, I see a lot of with their or strength and control in their hips. I see a lot of challenges with knee valgus, a lot of knees caving in, and feet flattening. So that's why I asked that question. I just wanted to know if you noticed some commonalities in those compensations. But let's move ahead. Let's talk about our dynamic assessment and what we're looking for in both of these tests.
So again, you can perform any dynamic assessment that you feel is going to be appropriate based on the sport as well as based on the individual that's coming in to see you. For this particular webinar, Marty and I chose the Davies test as well as the LESS test. And so again, if you're not familiar with the two, if you look bottom right, you're going to see kind of an example of both of those on the chart. So you would get in the Davies test, you would put the individual in a push-up position. Again, you're looking for, does their chin fall forward? Do they have scapular winging? Can they maintain control of their trunk? And at the same time, you're setting up the tape. Now, we have it set up for 36 inches because that's typically what you would do. However, if you have a little guy that comes in, 36 inches may be an extreme distance to cover. So it is okay to shorten that distance if it's appropriate for that individual. It's just every time you reassess, you're going to want to make sure that you set that out to whatever length that you're setting it out the first time. You're always going to have to remember to change back to whatever length each time to get adequate assessment data. And so you would, again, try to do 2 trials. The first one's mainly so they understand the pattern. And then at that point, you're going to have them do it as fast as they can for 15 seconds. And then, of course, you're going to take the best score. After you do that, one of the tests that I both really like, especially working with youth, is the LESS test. And for some of you guys that are unfamiliar with that particular dynamic assessment, the LESS test stands for the Landing Error Scoring System. And there is a ton of research out there utilizing this particular assessment, and there are multiple ways to perform it. However, you want to think that there's something called the real-time test. And basically what you're doing is you're using a 12-inch box, and you put a line out in front of the athlete that's about half the athlete's height, and that's the distance that you're asking them to jump out on. And then immediately they go and do a squat jump. And so if you're doing the real-time test, then you're going to do 2 per view, one from the anterior side and one lateral side. You're going to basically fill out a questionnaire, and mainly the questionnaire is usually 13 questions. There are some that are 8. It just kind of depends on which one you're using. And it's yes and no. And we're looking at basically what's happening what's underneath the trunk, and basically overall how coordinated are they. And so, if you want more about questions, then I would take in the book or look up online because it really is a great test. But then there's also something that you can set up videos, and that's the one that's commonly used. And you have a video camera on the side and on the front. And then you just have that particular athlete perform the same movements 3 different times. You record it, and then you go back and analyze it and answer the questions. And obviously, when you're looking at the compensations, each compensation has a specific point value, and determine the relative injury risk associated with that. And the higher point value that you receive from that data indicates there's a greater risk injury, or risk of injury, excuse me.
Okay. So that's a lot to take in. As Wendy said, you're going to have to do. I don't think we'll be able to take you through the entire test over the course of this webinar, but all of those resources are available for you, definitely online and in your CPT ES manuals. So let's go ahead and talk about the CES as it's related to children. And before we do, we have a question, and I'm going to read that to you. We have Aaron, and thank you for listening today, Aaron. I recognize Aaron. He is a repeat viewer. And Aaron wants to know, is there a ratio then according to shoulder distance, like 1.5 of the distance? And I'm going to speculate that we're possibly talking about the Davies test. Is there some sort of ratio that you use to determine that width in which you would have the athlete set up for the test, or is it just standard? Is it just a standard distance? One standard distance.
Well, probably what I do is, you want to think about the wingspan of each individual. And then at that point, you also want to think when they get into a push-up position, what is comfortable? And then I kind of use both of those as a guide. I don't think that there's something specific, or if there's a specific calculation of exactly how far apart to be based on height. I don't know that data specifically. So I would do is I kind of think about, all right, if if somebody comes in and they're 5 foot, then, all right, what would be, a challenging distance? But then also you want to think that you don't want them to be so far out that they lose base of control in their lower body and in their trunk, because you want to get good data on how they move and, can they maintain that alignment? So, okay. Marty, I don't know if you have a different answer to that, but.
No, again, 36 inches was the standard when the test was out. So I use that for adults. Now, again, if I have a female that is 5 foot, I'll adjust. And again, I'll just, what I'm looking for is outside their regular push-up position, I need them to move left and right outside that normal distance, because we're looking for that ability to control your core and your scapula and all that as you transition side to side. So basically, a rule of thumb is you could do it, every 6 inches or so. Do it 36, 30, 24, and then you just kind of, feel where everyone's appropriate. Or what I would do is when they get in their standard push-up, at least measure 4 inches left and right of where they set up. So that way they're at least transitioning. It's not going to be where they're just reaching and touching their hand. We're looking for a true movement to their left and to their right.
Okay, I think that pretty much settles it. So you want to set them up where it's going to be challenging, but where they also have a base of control where the test is going to be valid. And Aaron, I'm not sure if that was what you wanted to know, but if you could chime in the chat, let us know if that answered your question. And to also everyone else listening, please keep those questions coming. I know Wendy and Marty want to answer your questions while we have a captive audience for another 30 minutes at least. So keep those questions coming. And so let's move forward and talk about some program concepts for the youth regarding CES. And before we get into this specifically, what are some, since youth would be a special population, what are some considerations that we would look for? As an example, when I was growing up, I suffered from Osgood-Schlatter's. If you don't know what that is, it's a growth plate disorder, kind of like an avulsion fracture in your growth plate at the tibia. My daughter had a similar thing, but at the heel, called Seaver's disease. And knowing that there are all of these just potential contraindications related to growth, what are some of the considerations that we should know about training youth athletes? Let's start with you, Marty.
Sure. So first and foremost, you're going to want to, get the parents involved to make sure that you get their, consent, and also, speak to the pediatrician. It's always good to see if they've been medically cleared, if there's any of these underlying conditions, as you've talked about. And I also think very early on, it's good to see, what the concept of the parent's mindset is. You're going to get some parents that, might be kind of like those helicopter parents that are going to, maybe baby their children, which is fine. But that also lets you know maybe how the child's going to react as you're going through your training. But then you're also going to get some of those parents that are, going back to the days where they played football or lifted weights. It's no pain, no gain, because you're going to have to maybe do some education on both sides of that with the parent, and then understand how that may affect the child as they, are coming in because they've been in that environment. So it's just, can't give you exact specifics, but I think we know that the parent has to be involved throughout the process. And I always want to set up the expectations for the parent and the child as well. And then from there, what I'm going to say, and Wendy and I are going to get into this more, is take it slow. When you're dealing with youth, and I have 3 boys that are, my oldest is 21, my twins are 19. They still classify as youth in a sense. They're not fully developed. Obviously, they're towards the tail end of it. But when you're dealing with youth, there's no exact specific, do this for 13-year-olds and this for 15-year-olds. You've got different maturity level, different ability to follow instructions, different ability to focus, and we're all maturing at different abilities. And be very careful, and we can come back to this in a little bit because Wendy and I have talked about this, be very careful about the youth that matures very quickly. That doesn't mean that they're ready for an accelerated program just because they look bigger, they look stronger, they're more powerful, because their bones and their joints are still young. And if we look at where the orthopedic issues are, if God forbid somebody strains a muscle, that's going to heal pretty quickly, but we don't want to put stress on the joints. So those are kind of some key parameters. Obviously, if they have any medical issues that you need to be considerate with, whether it's diabetes, whether it's obesity, whether it's just general deconditioning, or all the type of other structural things that you mentioned, Prentiss, those things all have to come into account. But when you see how Wendy and I approach the programming, it's going to kind of protect itself because we're not rushing right to strength training, because that's not really the main priority for youth development, even for those athletes that, quote, want to get stronger or more powerful. And you'll see that as we talk about our program. So Wendy, of course, feel free to jump in there.
No, I mean, because you brought up injury, Prentiss, one of the key factors that I kept reading on was, that youth athletes, as Marty just said, there's a difference between being chronological age and developmental age. And so we need to keep that in mind. And kids are, or children are still growing. So the constant changes in the body weight, the height, the muscle mass, is going to provide additional stress on the joints and the connective tissue. So, keeping that in mind is going to be super, super important, because in young athletes, growth cartilage is present at the growth plate, as you just talked about, and as well as the musculotendinous insertion. So, it's going to be very vulnerable when we're placing, stress on it and we're designing programs and doing that. But if you have a well-designed program and it's following the recommended loads, sets, repetitions, and it's appropriate for that specific athlete's age and their body, then, you shouldn't have any injury or issues or injuries at all. So that's why it's very, very important. The rare cases that you get some of these fractures is that people are performing, movements and performing exercises and stuff by misusing the equipment. They don't have the right supervision. They're not being cued correctly. They don't have a program that really fits, their assessment results. People aren't doing these assessments. And so I think that's why it's kind of all inclusive and super, super important for the health of the athlete, as well as the developmental motor pattern and that you're doing when you're doing these types of workouts.
Yeah, I think that's a very good consideration. And also I'd like to add is there's the maturity of the athlete, there's the biological age, but then there's also the fact that you brought up that they're still growing. I have a 10-year-old, and she grew 5 inches in a year. In a calendar year, and she's now 5'6". So she can look eye to eye with you now, Wendy. But
I wish I was 5'6".
There are some things that we've noted that once you grow, it's almost like a reset on your nervous system. You kind of have to learn learn your mechanics over again and learn how to deal with different limb lengths, different weight distributions, and that's something you want to take into consideration as well when you're giving your athlete complex movements. So it's not, I like that you brought up that you can't really rush into this thing, and you have to constantly be looking at feedback that your athletes give you. So let's go ahead and move on to the program. Let's see what you did for our youth athletes.
Sure. Marty's going to use the board again to kind of talk through some of the stretches as well as how we designed it. Of course, basic assessment results is how we came up with some of this. But again, we're generalizing now because we're not using a specific case study. So for this particular, program, we are going to have the athlete perform a self-myofascial rolling on the calf complex, the adductors, the TF on the lats, and Marty's going to kind of go into the rationale of why.
Yeah, so just Wendy talked earlier what she sees in her clients, from adult, we also see in youth. They're going to basically move the same way. They're going to have the propensity to have overactive calf complex. The knees are going to cave in, some type of, poor posture. So common for the TFL, again, from the hip sitting, and then also the lats, being in that rounded position. So you never go wrong if you have to do a general program hitting these key areas.
Yes, and then after rolling, of course, we would go into static stretching if we saw compensations in the assessment. So you're obviously thinking that so we're going to have the athlete perform static stretching on the calf complex, the adductors, the lats, and we're going to now add in the pecs.
Okay. And I noticed that now when you're working with youth, you have dynamic stretching here. And we've talked about this in cases of adults, but why is it okay to put dynamic stretching in their warm-up in the CES template?
Well, I mean, if you kind of read about, training youth and you think about these individuals that are coming to you, learning a new exercise, you can think about, it's no load, higher repetition, and it's going to place focus on their form and their technique. So when we're adding in the dynamic stretching, we are actually developing, strength and promoting flexibility. And these exercises are going to be performed through the full available range of motion, which is really trying to teach those movement patterns that we want to carry over when we get into the resistance portion.
Okay, awesome. And I want to ask you one more, and this is another philosophical question about cueing, because everything you said just in that last little bit, I understand about the rationale, but to a kid, that sounds like the teacher, and I'm going to date myself, it sounds like the teacher from Charlie Brown, like a muted trombone. So how do you cue this to make this fun for your youth athletes?
I'm not sure how to take that comment there, Prentiss. However, I think I'm
just telling you, you've seen kids and you start talking about this and they're like, I don't get it. And their eyes glaze over. They start throwing out a lot of those terms.
I mean, for me, the big thing is I tell them, like, go through the full available range of motion. It's like, okay, that's great. We're not done with stretching. Now let's get you moving. We're going to start with prisoner squats and put your hands here. I want to do this. Like, make it fun, make it engaging. Don't make it boring because, they may not want to be there anyway. Their coach may have sent them because maybe in the off season, and there's a lot of good research saying what a good carryover it would be for them to do this in the off season. So I think it's same thing with building the rapport that you do with your older clients. You want to treat this the same, like find out their interests, make it fun, but don't go into the boring, lingo of like, and again, we had talked about making it positive. Show them what you want them to do and be like, hey, bring that left knee in, or hey, your foot's going out a little bit, bring it in, and then move on. Like don't sit there and harp on them the whole time.
Okay. All right. Let's go in. Yeah, go ahead.
To say under dynamic, we did have the athlete perform prisoner squats. as well as the walking lunges with rotation, and then a push-up with rotation. And Marty, you can to walk those.
Yep. So the thing, and Wendy, said it perfect. We're looking to get these young athletes to start to learn how to control movement three-dimensionally and, multiple joints together, getting everything coordinated in that beautiful movement. So prisoner squats, it's something that's very easy to, for everybody of all ages and all abilities to demonstrate. And again, we'll get them to the depth that they can control with some very simple cues. And then walking lunge with rotation, again, getting them to start to learn how to control things in the transverse plane, and then push up with rotation. We're getting that core in, getting them to learn how to balance on one arm and really activating all those shoulder stabilizers, but very easy visually to see what's going on instead of trying to walk them through verbally. We always say tell, show, do as an instructor or a trainer. Very easy to say, all right, guys, we're doing our prisoner squats. Watch me. Those are very simple exercises that once somebody sees it demonstrated can be able to do it. And then as a coach, really easy to modify one or two simple cues you can say without getting technical.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are all great points. And one thing that throw in there from my experience, when I had the opportunity to train small groups of youth, I would take this time to play very fierce games, which Simon says.
Exactly.
And that seemed to be a winner. So yeah, just continue like both Wendy and Marty have said. You have to make it fun. Don't talk too much. You can get a picture tells a big story. So
and Prentiss, going back to how we've taught, and been instructed in martial arts for years, we could do the I go, you go. So as people are getting better at these, you can alternate and let now some of, where you're helping cue with your other teammates or your other individuals in the session. So now it's, you're really trying to help your fellow colleague succeed in that I go, you. So I would center squats while Prentiss rests, vice versa. And that way they can coach each other, motivate each other. And now it's extra set of eyes for me, the coach, if it's a bigger group, where each one of my students or my athletes know how to perform these exercises and can cue their partner. So again, it makes that camaraderie a little bit, and everyone succeeds together.
Excellent. And that does check two boxes. When you're having them coach and cue one another after giving your instructions and motivating each other, that checks those two boxes of cognition and that emotional development that's so important for youth athletes. But since we're running out of time, I want to get through this program. Let's talk about activation, core balance, and tell us what you picked or why you picked what you picked for the youth athlete.
Well, sure. Of course, we're still following the continuum that we always have. And it's super important now that we know that we have muscles that are lengthened and ready to go to activate muscles that are potentially and usually overactive in multiple individuals. So we would have this athlete or this team perform bridges, floor cobras, side planks, lateral tube walks, and then single leg balance reach. And when, in that section alone, while Marty's writing it down, we're really trying to focus on the glutes, trying to focus on the core, focus on the middle to low back because of the rounded shoulders, obviously the forehead, so we can get them going into retraction and try to strengthen the muscles of the neck. And then, the lateral tube walking, again, because we often know that the glute med is weak, we would have them perform the tube walks for that reason. And then going in the single leg balance with Prentiss, you nailed it a little bit by, youth often pronate. So it's really good to work on arch alignment, which is also going to help with, the teaching proper movement patterns of keeping the second and toe in line with the knee. So, we'd start with the single leg balance, but we could progress with the reaches if they're ready. And of course, have it multi-planar. So, on how they do in each plane of motion. And then we would go into the skill development, so the plyo and SAQ. And so the squat jump with the hold, again, working on landing mechanics, maintaining the 5 kinetic change points, They are going to hold that landing. If their feet go out, we readjust them. If they have an arch in their back, we readjust them. So we're trying to train the brain the correct way to land. And then, of course, after that, we would go into the speed ladder. And we have full ladder. Of course, every distance is different, so we didn't want to put a particular distance. And we have 7 patterns. There's a ton of different patterns that you could do. The ones that I really like to do are, just a 1 in, a 10, the in and out, diagonal, ollie shuffle, hopping in and out of different, different ladders or different boxes. There's a multiple ways and any kind of type of patterns that you feel comfortable showing your athlete. It makes it super fun. And so we're doing this one-on-one, but if you had a team, you could actually, make it competitive, make it, like joke around with people. So again, you can do it on your feet. You can do it on your hands. There's multiple ways you can do the ladder, but the ladder really does increase the enjoyment in the program, especially when you're working with youth.
And let me ask you both a quick question about the ladder. Well, that's honest. I don't think I've ever asked a quick question since we've been doing these webinars, but I will continue. Is there, and this is more for everyone listening today, is there a continuum of techniques in your ability, in your speed ladder drills? Is there a technique that you'd start with and progress them to? Can you walk us through what your exercise selection is like, or what your thought process is for picking agility exercises? Wendy?
Sure. Of course, think about the 3 planes of motion. I mean, we move in 3 planes of motions. Sports are, multi-planar. So we want to get them moving, obviously, in all 3 planes as quickly as we can, but we also want to make it safe. So doing things in the sagittal plane by just running in and out, whether they run forward, they can come backwards. Like getting used to the sagittal plane is usually the easiest. And then moving them into more of the frontal plane by doing, the ollie shuffle, by, doing different types of movements like that going in the frontal plane. And then afterwards, if you know that they own those 2 particular planes of motion, then you start to have them add some rotational movements. So I wouldn't treat that any different than I would treat an exercise selection that I'm doing with an individual on the programming design side. Marty, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
I was going to explain it the exact same way, and then basically keeping one simple pattern. Where sometimes you're going in to out and all those things. Those are the end, or going backwards would be final part of it, but always following the planes of motion.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So now, let's talk about resistance training for our youth athlete. What was your rationale for picking the exercises that you did in this block?
Well, we know with working with children that, we're going to use sub-maximal loads. So when we're designing a program, you want to keep that in mind, because we really want to focus and hone in on their form and their techniques in a variety of planes of motion, and using a variety of different, equipment or body weight, mainly body weight, to make sure that they can control what they have. So with that being said, we did bring out, a piece of band or tubing, and had the individual go into a squat to row. Marty, do you want to talk about why?
Yeah, certainly. Just like, for anyone that's been on the webinars in the past, this is one of our go-to exercises, because you're really getting that triple flexion to triple extension. The band or the cable, if you were in a gym, helps guide the movement pattern so they learn how to squat better, forces core activation. And as you come up, you're getting extension with retraction. And then if you're getting that chin in the right position, you're getting that total body alignment. It's really guiding them to learn how to squat while you're giving them some assistance with the band, or if you did it in a gym with a cable.
And then, of course, we are following the 4-2-1 tempo, because we are kind of designing this as a phase 1 program. But then we would go into a kneeling half band chest press. And Marty can talk us through why on that as well.
Yeah. So instead of just getting right into push-ups or any type of standard chest press, as soon as we go to that half kneeling, they're going to have to fight and work their core. The athlete or the youth might think, oh, great, I'm doing chest. That's a secondary part for us. It's really, can they control their entire core, which of course includes their scapula. And so that way we're getting that full pushing pattern and with that plus to get that full protraction. And again, watching things about, can they keep their core in neutral? Can they keep their head tucked and their chin tucked into that neutral position? The chest part of it is kind of secondary for us, but we don't tell that to our client necessarily. But we're going to put them in a chance to get a lot of neuromuscular control going on. And then we can also watch what happens when you switch from one half kneeling on the right to the left. Sometimes you'll see that medius, boom, all of a sudden they can do it great with their right leg down, but they can't do it left leg down. So it's another way to see how their body's wired and see if we need to target anything in another program.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always enjoyed using half kneeling and kneeling progressions. Because it's just, even though we are definitely training the core, but it also gives them less that they have to control being on the floor. They're only responsible at that point for their hip, the LPHC, and not everything below the hip. So it gives them a little bit less to control. It reinforces things that they've already learned by doing planks at this time. So I love that progression there.
Yep, and then we would go right into a stability ball combo 2.
And Marty, why did we pick that one?
So again, we're looking for that retraction and external rotation because most of us, all of us, including our youth, are going to be in that forward flexed, upper cross syndrome position. So we're trying to get them out of that. And then by using a stability ball, one, it's engaging and fun for them. So there's that cognitive, they're having to learn how to control themselves. Plus now we're getting that triple extension on the backside of their body. Neutral the spine, are activated, quads are tight, and they're pushing into a wall or some type of firm object. So as I've said before, we use this term a lot, that accidental exercise. So they're also training their lower body in that triple extension position, but really just working on that retraction with external rotation without losing the neutral spine.
And then we would end the resistance portion with a frontal plane lunge to balance.
So
okay. Yep.
Here we want to get things into the frontal plane. We don't want to always just stay sagittal. So we want to start to shift to some, frontal plane movement. Down the line, we'd get into transverse plane. But really, as we go into that frontal plane, we're opening up the adductor on one side, and we're really using the glute and glute medius to drive back, and then the core and all those muscles in the foot all the way up through when we finish in a balanced position. So again, a lot of bang for our buck there, but makes the athlete kind of focus on learning how to control things now in a different plane of motion.
Yep, and then after that, we would get into the client's choice, which really this is more of the trainer's choice, and this is actually one of more of my choices, but I would say finish with a leg circuit. Again, circuits are super, super fun because once you show them the 4 movement patterns that you want them to do, you want them to execute it as fast as they can. Of course, you are monitoring their movement at all times, so it needs to be controlled. But, for example, the leg circuits that I usually go with in the sagittal plane would be prisoner squats and to alternating lunges and to power step ups, and then they would finish with 10 squat tucks. And again, you can use any ones that you like, and you can do different, again, planes of motion. However, those are the ones that I usually teach individuals how to do first and then build upon that. And then, of course, after they get done doing the 2 sets of the resistance as well as the client's choice, we would go into the cool down, which we know is going to be extremely important because if you have a youth not do it there in your session, they probably will not do it at home.
Right. Yes, and they are going to need this cool down after the leg circuit. I don't see myself completing it without having Baby Shark on repeat.
Oh.
So you'll need to go into cool down just to restore body, help it to recover for that next bout of exercise. So, and it should look like a lot of like what we did in our warm up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there really wasn't any changes that we did in the rolling. We didn't include the TFL, but of course include that And then on the static stretches, we did include the hip flexors as well. And you could have done those in the beginning. We were just, again, we're kind of generalizing the warm up because we don't really have assessment results to base it off of.
Right. And speaking of, and reason why that's okay, if we look down, just for the other fit pros who are listening, if we're looking at that half kneeling exercise, talk about accidental exercise. If you're having to hold a stable half kneeling position without compensation, yeah, just guess what you're stretching out at that point.
Exactly.
So it's all in there at various points within the template. It doesn't necessarily always have to be in its specific block. You just have to figure out where to put it in intelligently. Okay, so is there anything else we need to know from this particular, from little Timmy's template?
Nope, I think we covered it.
Okay.
Just make it and be very encouraging and keep it positive, because it can be setting these individuals up for a lifelong enjoyment of fitness. Is awesome.
All right, I'm going to ask you, since you gave us that takeaway, Marty, let's stay with you. And I want to ask you another philosophical question. Tell us again your strategy on how to communicate this if we do work with competitive athletes. How do you communicate the value of this to coaches?
Sure. So the beautiful thing, if you're following the NASM model, this was built by Dr. Mike Clark, who was working, at North Carolina with elite athletes. And it's been evidence-based and it's been proven. And what's so good right now is what we see in fitness. Now it's recovery and all these other things. Most of all that starts in elite sports anyways. So we've got an advantage to tell a story that we are following a program that was designed to work with elite athletes, and we're just bringing it to you as a youth athlete and as a coach of youth athletes. And 20 years ago, all the science was still coming out proving this methodology to be right. We now have 20 years of science showing that this is the best system in all the different teams. And, you see it now on Instagram all the time, people rolling and doing all these techniques. So now it's not so abstract as like when Wendy and I were early in the game, and same thing with you, Prentiss, we were carrying foam rollers into a gym and people didn't even know what it was. So when you tell that story of why you've chosen to be educated by NASM and why you're following this, and that this is for the best athletes in the world, it's a little bit easier to convince those coaches, because I think there's enough data and points out there now about injuries and recovery, and people understand mobility and stability now way more than they did in the past. So I think you're going to have a buy-in, and that you're going to just help the coach and you're going to help the team and the parents in the long run. So I think it's just an awesome opportunity to go out there and make a huge impact.
Okay, thanks, Marty. And I know we can see it on the screen, but again, just tell us where to find you, where to send follow-up questions.
Sure. So marty.miller@nasm.org. And then Instagram is miller.marty72. And then tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. East Coast time, I'll be doing a coffee talk. So feel free to jump in there. If there's any other questions that kind of stem from what we're talking about today, we can bring them back up tomorrow live on Instagram.
All right. Thank you, Marty. And Wendy, what are your big takeaways for today? And tell us how we can find you and ask questions.
Well, I guess the big thing is strength training formed in a controlled and supervised environment can help children and adolescents of all athletic abilities to safely improve and strengthen their overall health and well-being. So the health benefits of strength training are going to far outweigh the potential risks if done in this specific type of controlled environment, especially when you look at today's society where childhood obesity continues to rise. So I think there's a lot of great benefits. The OPT model, of course, because it is systematic, progressive, and researched, I think it's easy to get the buy-ins from the coaches as well as the parents. And, I think the big thing, too, is training, these individuals that come in to you is have fun with it. Don't overcomplicate it on their end. Just make sure that it makes sense on your end. And then, just continue to reassess and make sure that they're progressing along the way that they should. And then, of course, you can me by email at wendy.bats@nas.org. And my Instagram is wendy.bats13.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again, Wendy and Marty. This was very fun and, as always, educational. Thanks to Greg, for keeping it together. And thank you for everyone who joined us today and everyone who will watch this later. Everyone have a great afternoon. Stay safe, and we will see you soon.